We want to come out of the EU on October the 31st. That is what we're going to do.
But the question is, how? Deal or no deal? We will take a look at Britain's pained efforts to exit the European Union just 3 months ahead of an already extended deadline. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The new British Prime Minister Boris Johnson campaigned for Brexit in 2016 and now has the mission to deliver it, a task that is not easy for many reasons, among them the question of what to do with the border between the Republic of Ireland and the UK's province of Northern Ireland. A withdrawal agreement with the EU left a soft border there, but that deal was shot down 3 times by the British Parliament, leading to the resignation of Prime Minister Theresa May. The new Prime Minister wants to renegotiate, but has also said that he's willing to face a hard Brexit if necessary, leaving the European Union without a deal.
I would prefer us to leave the EU with a deal. I would much prefer it. I believe that it is possible even at this late stage, and I will work flat out to make it happen. But certain things need to be clear. The withdrawal agreement negotiated by my predecessor has been 3 times rejected by this House. Its terms are unacceptable to this Parliament and to this country.
Well, to discuss all the ramifications of Brexit, let's meet our panel. Straight out of London, Joe Twyman is a co-founder and director of Deltapoll, a public opinion research firm. Ian Black is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. Dr. Alan Wager is a research associate at the United Kingdom in a Changing Europe initiative at London's King College. And Philip Foster is the vice chairman of the Campaign for an Independent Britain. Welcome to all of you. Joe Twyman, let me start with you. So Boris Johnson has taken office, and of course his big job right now is to steer Britain through Brexit. Can he get a better deal with the European Union in the short time that he has left? The deadline is about 3 months away, October 31st. Can he do it?
If you ask the people who are responsible for the negotiations on the European side, they say it's not possible. They say that the deal is the deal, there isn't a better deal available, and that Britain has to decide whether it is going to take it or leave it. If you speak to Boris Johnson and his team, he will tell you that a better deal is possible and that Britain will do everything they can to pursue that deal. But if circumstances don't move in their favour, then they're willing to leave without a deal. The reality is probably somewhere in between the two. I imagine that if we get to September, or particularly if we get to October, the pressure of the October 31st deadline will focus minds in a way that they are perhaps not focused at the beginning of the summer holiday for most of Europe. So I imagine that some adjustment to the existing deal will be possible. The question is, will that be enough then to satisfy Boris Johnson? Will that be enough to satisfy his government? And most importantly, will that be enough to get through the House of Commons?
All right, let me get the view of Dr. Alan Wager. Dr. Wager, it seems that both sides are digging their heels in. They have very entrenched positions. This was a spokesperson for the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker. This is what she had to say. Let's listen.
President Juncker spoke to Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the phone. President Juncker listened to what Prime Minister Johnson had to say and reiterated the EU's position that the withdrawal agreement is the best and only agreement possible.
So if we listen to the two sides there, Alan Wager, are we heading for a confrontation here?
I'd be a bit more pessimistic than Joe. I think the politics on the EU side are pretty problematic if we're hoping for the sort of change that could be signed up to by Boris Johnson, given what he said so far. So I think, for example, in Ireland, the politics only head in one direction. It would be almost impossible for Varadkar to give up the backstop arrangement, which is the principal problem in the UK. Although there's some signs of unity within the EU 27, it's unlikely to put enough pressure on Ireland to change that position. And think about the problem of agreeing to a change that has been asked for by Boris Johnson, who many in Europe, particularly in key capitals, see as part of a sort of populist problem, if you like, that is in the spreading throughout the European Union?
Philip Foster, everybody, of course, is looking at all kinds of options. We have Jean-Claude Juncker's successor, Ursula von der Leyen, who will take office on November 1st. She says the European Union would be open to extending that deadline if there is a good reason to extend it. Do you see it being extended? And for what reason would it be extended?
Well, I think speaking for my sort of constituency, insofar as I got an ear to the ground, I don't think anyone would cope with an extension. We've already had one ghastly one. Everybody was told 108 times by our previous Prime Minister that we were leaving on the 29th of March. That came and went. I think the idea of another one on the 31st of October, and that fails to materialize, populist or not, I think it would cause enormous trouble. And I don't think Boris would, frankly, go for that.
Ian Black, Boris Johnson is also sticking firmly to Brexit by October 31st. This is his position. Let's watch this.
Our mission is to deliver Brexit on the 31st of October for the purpose of uniting and re-energising our great United Kingdom and making this country the greatest place on earth. In the 98 days that remain to us, we must turbocharge our preparations to make sure that there is as little disruption as possible to our national life.
So, Ian, given the divisions that we've already seen in the ruling Conservative Party on Brexit, is Boris Johnson going to be able to deliver on this in the terms that he just used? We're going to be the greatest nation on earth.
Well, I belong with the pessimists on this. I don't think that Boris Johnson can succeed in what he has promised to deliver. He's a larger-than-life personality. People either love him or loathe him. He has the ability to light up a room and to enthuse people, but I don't see any reason why those qualities should enable him to succeed where his predecessor so conspicuously and so often failed. I think that the Conservatives under Boris Johnson and also previously underestimate the degree of self-interest in the EU 27 in protecting what is going to be theirs after Britain's departure. And the key question of the Northern Ireland backstop is, of course, related closely to that. So I think that there is a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of flamboyant speeches, and Boris is nothing if not quotable. But his ability to deliver, as he's promised to do so, while emphasizing the preparations for that dreaded no-deal departure, I don't think he's going to make it.
Ian, I want to get to the backstop in a moment, but just to Joe Twyman's earlier point, and that is, as we get closer to that deadline, it might have the effect of focusing the minds, both in Brussels and in London, on working out some kind of a deal that would be acceptable to both sides. Do you see that happen?
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between the agreement that was negotiated very laboriously over a long period by Theresa May. That's the withdrawal agreement from the EU. And then there's a separate, that's a very long document. I think it's about 600 pages long, very, very detailed. Then there's a separate, a much shorter document called a political declaration, which is about the future relationship between the EU and Britain outside the EU. Now, the 27 leaders have often hinted at their readiness to look at the future relationship, but they have insisted pretty firmly and fairly unanimously to not to deviate from the withdrawal agreement as negotiated by Theresa May. So it comes down to very, very important questions about the integrity of the single market, about the Northern Ireland border, and of course about the claim by the Leave campaign led by Boris Johnson that Britain would be seizing back control from the EU. That was the headline figure, if you like. I don't think that that is possible given the current standoff and given the interests of the EU in protecting the status quo and not allowing Britain, if you like, to have its cake and eat it too.
All right, Joe Twyman, let's talk about the backstop. Some of our other guests have been talking about it as well. This is one of the biggest challenges that Boris Johnson will face. The backstop is an agreement that there will be no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in the event that Britain leaves the EU without a comprehensive agreement. This is what Boris Johnson had to say, and it's followed by a comment from the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar. Let's listen to this.
What we want to do is to make it absolutely clear that the backstop is no good. It's dead. It's got to go.
The backstop is an integral part of the withdrawal agreement. Without the backstop, there is no withdrawal agreement.
So Boris Johnson says it has to go. Leo Varadkar says no, it has to be there. Question is, if Johnson doesn't want the backstop, what replaces it?
Well, the alternative is perhaps a backstop with a time limit. That could be seen as a sufficient position for Europe. Apparently, within the initial negotiations with Theresa May's team, a backstop time limit was never even suggested. There are rumours that Europe might be, in certain circumstances, open to that kind of small adjustment. Whether that would be enough for Boris Johnson and his team remains to be seen. But that is a possible option. Precisely what form that would take remains very much up in the air. But some sort of limit, whether it's a time limit or something else on the backstop, plus a change to the political declaration, may, and I do stress may, be enough to at least get this over the line in the first instance. There's a whole other question about whether that would be sufficient to the people of Britain, those people, the 52% of people who voted to leave, whether that would feel sufficiently real in terms of Brexit for them. But certainly in terms of the politics, that may be enough. But it's all very uncertain. And in this position that we're in at the moment, with a situation of continual brinkmanship between the two sides, it's difficult to see either side making a concession. But as I say, there are suggestions that actually, with 3 months to go, nothing much is going to get changed. With 3 weeks to go, things may be different. We cannot underestimate the EU's ability to muddle through with things, as it has shown in various stages in the past. I agree that up until now they have been extremely clear, extremely united, and certain on their position regarding not just the backstop but the withdrawal agreement in totality. But as I say, with 3 weeks to go, may the situation change? My view is that there's a chance it might.
Philip Foster, how much room does Boris Johnson have to manoeuvre or to negotiate the backstop? Because there's now also pressure coming from this side of the Atlantic, from the United States. There's a bipartisan group here in the United States Congress, which is saying that they will block any trade deal, a bilateral trade deal, with the United Kingdom if Johnson rejects the backstop and in effect reestablishes a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I mean, how significant is that pressure on Boris Johnson from the United States?
That I don't know. I, in fact, was unaware of that particular threat. I wasn't aware Trump had said that. But my feeling is, you say that
it's
Boris is going to reinstate the border. Well, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, Congress. So I know that my own confusion there. But what I'm getting at, I was unaware of that particular statement. Nonetheless, the idea that we will re-establish a border has never been suggested. It will be the Republic of Ireland that will have to establish a border if they choose to. We don't particularly want to have one, and we don't intend to build one, from what I understand. So, in a sense, it takes us back as to whether an agreement is going to be possible. I think my view is very unlikely. I have no particular qualms myself as an ordinary man about leaving without a deal. I think we may find that would actually focus a lot of minds in Brussels, far more than trying to get to the line of 31st of October with some kind of a deal. If we leave, then we can negotiate. I think that was always should have been what we should have done. Leaving means leaving. It doesn't mean hanging on and coming to some sort of deal. You leave and then you negotiate.
Ian Black, what are your thoughts on the backstop? Can it be renegotiated? We did a show on this a few weeks ago, and one of the options that was discussed there was that the Northern Ireland could be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. And in fact, what that would mean was pushing the border to the Irish Sea. And you know, the German Chancellor has also talked of the backstop being overwritten. We don't know what that means, but can it be renegotiated at this stage?
Well, I mean, again, we don't know. The clock is ticking. I mean, I agree with the notion that the closer we get to October the 31st, the more minds will be concentrated on that. I mean, I think that it's important to say in response to the previous speaker, I mean, just perhaps in brackets, is that there is mounting alarm about the economic consequences, which are widely seen to be catastrophic, of a no-deal Brexit. I mean, there's any number of indicators of that, whether it's the prospects for future inward investment or the plummeting exchange rate of the pound, or the millions of pounds that the government is spending on preparations for a no-deal Brexit, and so on and so forth. But on the backstop itself, there's been talk in the past of technological solutions, of using, modern high-tech methods to monitor the border in a way that preserves the integrity of the single market, which is the Irish interest, of course, as a member state of the EU and as a potential neighbour of what would become a country outside the bloc. So technological solutions, we've heard a lot about those, and I think that the most likely thing to work, although this is purely speculative, is if there was an agreement to give a time limit to the backstop that might be acceptable to the British side. But I mean, I have no idea. The initial responses of the government of the Irish Republic to the Boris Johnson premiership have been extremely negative, and the rest of the EU has a duty to defend the rights of one of its member states, and there's no way getting around that.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Alan Wager on this particular issue. Dr. Wager, there has been talk of this so-called digital border that could be created, but is there, do you believe, an appetite in Brussels to renegotiate the backstop? Can the EU persuade the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, to look at some other deal?
I think it's very unlikely. The ex-ambassador to the UK was on television in the UK last night saying that it would be like shooting your right foot after being threatened with someone trying to shoot your left foot. The idea that the backstop could be got rid of on the whim of the UK government, and that we'd end up with a situation where there would probably, almost certainly, have to be a border on the island of Ireland in any case. That's the way that the Irish government see it. They just see it as an inevitability that if we don't have the guarantee that there will be no hard border, then there will have to be checks away from the border. It won't be necessarily a fence or anything like that. It wouldn't be anything like that. It would be digitally done, away from the border and so on. But there would be no frictionless movement for people and for goods and so on. And they see any time limit on the backstop as basically making the backstop defunct and unusable and pretty pointless.
Joe Twyman, over the months of this crisis, we've heard talk of there being a new referendum, possibly a new general election in Britain as well. But Boris Johnson is standing firm. Let's listen to what he had to say on that.
The British people voted in 2015, in 2016, in 2017. Why on earth? What they want us to do is deliver on their mandate to come out of the EU on October the 31st. They don't want another electoral event. They don't want a referendum. They don't want a general election.
Is Boris Johnson, Joe Twyman, painting himself into a bit of a corner here, reducing his options by being so entrenched in his views on what he wants to do?
Well, I think if Boris Johnson had a reputation for sticking to what he said, then that might be a problem, but quite the opposite is true. Essentially, over the next few months, a key question has to be answered by Boris Johnson and his team, and that is this: what is more difficult, leaving with Brexit, having not achieved a new general election, or having a new general election, having not achieved Brexit? That's the key question, because at the moment, and to go back to your previous point, Ireland as an island will not be dealt with separately while the Democratic Unionist Party are the Conservatives' partners in coalition. They refuse point blank to accept the notion that Northern Ireland will be treated differently from the rest of Great Britain, from the rest of the United Kingdom, sorry. And so they are not negotiating on that. In doing so, they endanger the whole of the majority, the working majority that the government has. And so the only way out of that is a general election, but calling a general election before Brexit covers huge risks. The alternative, trying to get things through, but then holding a general election, runs the risk that nothing gets through. And indeed, we crash out with no deal, and that is damaging to the Conservatives' fortunes. So it's a really, really difficult task for the government. And I think certainly the month of August will be about looking at their position in the polls. Where are they? How long is any particular bounce for the new Prime Minister lasting for? And also, what is the mood music in Europe, in the EU? Is there options behind the scenes for some sort of negotiation? That sort of information will help provide the answer to that key question.
Philip Foster, when we look at all the implications of Brexit, there's one other issue, and that is the integrity of the United Kingdom. Voters in Scotland, we know, during that referendum, voted to stay in the European Union. Might Scotland then not call another referendum, an independence referendum, which could ultimately lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom?
I suppose it could. I think it would be interesting to see what the actual answer would be again, like last time. Incidentally, just going on referendums in general, people say they want a second referendum on the Brexit issue. Well, there was one. It was called the European elections, and it was comprehensively won by Leave. That's by the by. But I grant you, I think there is a sort of risk of that in going back to Scotland. But let's face each one as it comes. If that happens, I mean, Ireland wants to do the same. Sinn Féin is saying they're desperate to keep in with Brussels. Strange thing for a party that calls itself Ourselves Alone, and are pushing for a referendum to reunite Ireland. All these things certainly could happen. It might even happen in Wales. But sometimes I think we find, as with the last Scottish referendum, everybody was saying, oh, they're going to make it this time, but they didn't. And the Scots are not stupid, in my view, being quarter Scottish and quarter Welsh.
All right, Alan Wager,
Just a trace of Irish.
Alan Wager, we've been talking a lot about the implications for Britain, of course, but what kind of disruption would there be to the European Union if there is a no-deal Brexit? I mean, does Brussels have any kind of a plan B?
Absolutely, there would be a significant amount of disruption, and that tallies with what Joe's saying about the increase in pressure as we get to October that will be felt by people like Emmanuel Macron. France is one of the countries that is most likely to be hit after the UK and Ireland, and he is the hardest advocate of getting the European Union out, potentially with a no deal as soon as the 31st of October. So that's going to weigh on the minds of these European leaders as they go to this European Council in October, in mid-October, and make the decision about whether or not to potentially run through with no deal, push forward with no deal, or think about an extension to Article 50 or whatever. Some of these countries, particularly France, Germany, the Netherlands, are going to be affected economically by no deal and are already in a deteriorating economic state at the moment.
Ian Black, of course, many challenges for the new British Prime Minister, but what do we know about his negotiating style, about his ability to get some kind of agreement? I mean, he's a man with experience. He's been Foreign Secretary. He's also been Mayor of London. Twice he's been Mayor of London. What does that tell us?
Well, on the Foreign Secretary point, he spent about a year as Foreign Secretary when Theresa May was still Prime Minister. He's widely considered to have been pretty much disastrous on all fronts. There's a particular issue where he misspoke in Parliament, put it politely, and enormously complicated the case of a dual national British-Iranian woman being held and still being held in Iran. He has a reputation for not bothering to read his detailed briefs. He likes to make statements off the cuff without necessarily consulting. So he doesn't have a good reputation in the highest office of state that he ever had. It's true that he has a more positive image, if you like, from the period that he spent as Mayor of London. But of course, what's most important, I think, to remember about our current Prime Minister is that on the eve of the 2016 referendum, and he led the campaign, it's important to remind people, he led the campaign for Britain to leave the European Union. He famously wrote 2 articles. Boris Johnson has spent a lot of his life as a journalist. He wrote 2 articles, one in favour of leaving the EU and the other against leaving the EU. And until the very last minute, he couldn't decide which of them to publish. And that has reinforced the strong impression that his political positions are determined by nothing more than self-interest. So it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember that in the years that he spent as a journalist, including a few years in Brussels reporting for the Daily Telegraph, a very right-wing and anti-European British newspaper, he contributed hugely to the negative reputation and appearance that the European Union has in this country. Brussels became a term of abuse, largely due to his efforts. So he is not trusted at the European level, and that's an important part of his ability to deliver on what he has pledged.
Right, Joe Twyman, that of course is one view of Boris Johnson, but there have also been some media reporting that it would be risky to underestimate his abilities. Right now, I mean, he comes across, especially if you look here in the American media and the US media, as foppish, befuddled, absent-minded. If you look at what he's done so far, he's formed 2 committees on Brexit, the Exit Strategy Committee, known as XS, and the Daily Operations Committee, which will look at the details of what happens if there's a no-deal Brexit. Is there a risk that the EU could be underestimating this man?
No, I don't think so. I think for all his act and all his buffoonery, I think there is a determination underneath. Now, precisely what that motivation is remains up for debate. But I think there is a recognition that he is certainly significantly smarter than he likes to appear at times. And indeed, anyone who has met him in private will have seen that emerge. I don't think that this will come as any surprise to anyone on the EU side who's involved with this negotiation. He has been in politics and in political circles for many, many years now, and while the general public may have one view of him, those in the Westminster bubble and certainly those in Brussels will have another view that is well formed and broadly accurate.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is all for this edition of The Heat. But you can listen to more in our podcast. We'll be covering stories from around the world in a bit more personal and candid manner with our guests and correspondents. And the conversation also continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.